Okay, let's talk about community interaction specifically now. So, just to recap, remember that communities are all the biotic components of an ecosystem. So, we're looking at interactions between a variety of populations now, not just a single population. And so, these interactions fall mainly into three categories. You probably know them pretty well, at least two of them: predation, competition, and symbiosis. So predation is the consumption of another species. Most of us think of true predation. When we think of predation, that's where the predator species kills the prey. There's also grazing predation, where the predator is eating part of the prey. So this could be herbivores, or especially I think of a particular type of fish that we'll talk about later on that are specialized to grab only a few scales off another fish. So they're literally grazing on other species of fish. In true predation, the predator population is keeping the prey population in balance, and the two population sizes are oscillating. So you see that the prey has to reach a certain density to support the predators, and then an increase in the predators causes a decrease in the prey, and then that pattern repeats itself as the predators and prey stabilize each other. So predators and prey are clearly affecting each other, but they don't just affect each other in terms of size or density. Most predators have to have adaptations to make them stealthy or speedy in order to be successful. You see also that predators and prey sometimes adopt camouflage, and so there's a predator clearly blending into its environment. One of my favorite examples is the octopus, so hopefully we'll get to watch a little video clip of that in class. Some prey species will also use mimicry. Well, actually, let me show you one more example of camouflage here. That's a praying mantis. There are thousands of species of praying mantis, and this one blends right into this orchid, so it can just hang out and wait for a pollinator to come by, which are its prey, and it gets a little bite to eat, and it didn't have to move at all, or very little. Alright, now moving on. So, a lot of prey species will also use mimicry. So they'll mimic a more dangerous animal, or they'll use, like in this case, some sort of bright warning coloration that's typically found in poisonous or bitter tasting animals of a similar but different species. All of these accumulating adaptations encourage new adaptations in the opposing species because their close relationship with each other, predator and prey, generally leads to a co-evolutionary arms race. So that's where each species is accumulating new adaptations in response to the other. So here you're seeing snakes, and I think that's supposed to be a newt there. So you've got toxins and then responses to the toxins. You also see this, we look at cheetahs and gazelles and a lot of these animals that live on the African plains that are so fast, and that speed was probably part of an arms race as well. And my final note about predation, you had no idea there was so much to predation, right? Is that I know that it sometimes seems, bad or mean to think of all these cute little animals getting eaten by predators, but predators can be so important to the stability of a community, and so often we refer to them as keystone species. Now, keystone species is not just referring to predators, but it's referring to any species that are so essential to their community structure that removing them often results in some sort of extreme instability, and often that means losses to biodiversity. So you're going from, in this case, we're looking at the sea star. When the sea star is there and it's feeding on mussels and also sometimes sea urchins, you have 15 other species that can coexist in this community. But when the sea star is absent, the mussels kind of take over. They have no other natural predators, and so you see the biodiversity go from 15 species to 8. And then the last little thing, I don't have a slide for this, but sometimes predators can even be helpful in removing invasive species, especially invasive pests, but you have to be very, very careful with this. So it's a biological pest control rather than a chemical pest control, but you've got to pick a predator that is so specific to its prey that it's only going to eat the prey and it's not going to end up doing more damage to the ecosystem and the community structure than it does good. So you want less harm, more help. Next up is competition. So competition can occur between members of the same species, and so that's your intra-specific. It can also be inter-specific. And intra-specific competition is beneficial because it can help maintain the population size, and it can weed out genes that are not beneficial. Interspecific competition is probably the type of competition that most people are thinking about when they say competition. It can become very fierce if it's between similar species, and it can often lead to extinction. So again, think about those invasives and think about the competitive exclusion principle. If two species are trying to occupy the exact same niche, that can drive extinction sometimes faster than it can drive adaptations to new habitats. Symbiosis is a close, long-lasting relationship between two species. We're looking here probably at least one of the two species always benefiting. Now, in biology, I hesitate to say always, but in symbiosis, just like in most relationships with people, why would you keep up a relationship if everyone in the relationship was negatively affected? I hope you wouldn't do this. Generally, in a long-term relationship, at least one person is benefiting. You can have those frenemy type relationships where someone's benefiting and the other person's not so sure if their friend is really their friend or not. But this can get complicated. But we're going to look at 3 types of symbiosis, and in all those types, one of the two species is benefiting. So the first one we're going to look at, parasitism. Parasites live on or in a host species, so they're often much smaller than the host species. And a good parasite, a parasite that's well adapted to its host, is going to live on or in the host without killing it. So it's going to sap a little bit of its energy or nutrients, but if it were to kill or sicken its host, well, then it loses its host and it would have to find a new host or die trying. So again, good parasite doesn't kill its host. The next one we'll look at is mutualism, and I think this is such a cool type of symbiotic relationship. You end up seeing some very, very cool adaptations from this super close relationship. And it's the ideal relationship. Everyone's winning here. So, coevolution. It results in coevolution. Here you're looking at a type of moth that is actually the pollinator for a specific type of orchid called the Madagascar star orchid. And it's got this really long nectar spur that you can see here. And so Darwin actually found this orchid. He never in his lifetime found the pollinator, but he hypothesized that evolution and natural selection would create an organism or lead to an organism with a trait well suited to obtaining that nectar at the end of the long nectar spur. And so we've discovered it now. It's a nocturnal moth. And if you're wondering how this came about, like what was the pressure, why did the orchid, what was the benefit to the orchid of having such a long nectar spur? And that's that, the way orchids work to be pollinated it needed the moth to rub its face in the pollen, and so moving the nectar away from the moth got the moth to kind of rub its face in the pollen, and so the moth kept, or the natural selection kept favoring moths with very long tongues and orchids with very long nectar spurs. So that's another great classic example of both mutualism but also coevolution. Finally, there's commensalism. This is kind of the in-between of the symbiotic relationships, where one species is clearly benefiting, the other is not really affected, it's not hurt, it's not really helped. I really think as we continue to study these relationships, a lot of them are going to turn out to be mutualism or parasitism. There's some, like eyelash mites, where there's already debate about whether those eyelash mites are a parasite or whether they're helping, eat the little oils in your eyelashes, or whether they're not really doing anything, and it's commensalism. A classic example of commensalism is the cattle egrets. So they kind of hang out by these foraging herbivores and wait for the herbivores that are not interested in insects to stir up the insects, and the egrets, can more easily hunt down their prey. So to recap, you've got mutualism. I like to think of it as a smiley face, everyone wins. Parasitism. One good, one bad, thumbs up, thumbs down, however you want to think of it. And then your commensalism, where you've got one happy and the other one, well, it's not applicable, it's neutral. But the bottom line here that this graphic organizer really makes apparent is that one species is always benefiting. And that's it for our discussion of community interactions. Thanks for listening.